Hey people, welcome back. In today's video, I will be installing and reviewing the CO2 kit for the GHK Glock 17. This will include comparing the FPS, trigger pull, and recoil to the original. Any updates or corrections can be found in the pinned comment below. This kit comes with several replacement parts, and all of the metal parts that I've tested have been steel. You will get a reinforced nylon nozzle, enhanced recoil spring, steel inner barrel and hop-up unit, and a steel trigger housing unit. Alright, let's finally get this thing into our gun. To install the trigger housing, you simply need to punch out these two pins here. If you've seen my improved trigger installation video, there will be nothing new here. Removing the slide is very simple on the Glock. Just pull down on these two switches and push forward on the back of the slide. On the GHK Glock, these switches are very tight, so I have to use both hands to hold them down while hitting the back of the slide against the table. Here you can see the part that we're going to be replacing. Let's start by punching out the silver pin, which is on the top. I recommend using a slightly undersized pin punch to avoid damaging the plastic frame. Please note this notch in the pin. This should be on the left side when you reinstall it into the gun. Next, punch out the black pin, which is on the bottom. Just like the silver one, it has a notch which must be on the left side when reinstalled. And with that, the trigger housing can be easily removed. So let's insert the new trigger housing and reinstall the pins. Remember to make sure that the slot is on the left side of the gun. Simply hammer in the black pin. There are no extra steps needed. However, for the silver pin, you need to do two separate tasks. First, push forward on the silver trigger bar. It needs to be underneath the silver pin, like this. Now, push the spring end down. It must also be underneath the silver pin. And just hammer the pin in the rest of the way. Also, make sure that the spring end is in the notch on the pin that I mentioned earlier. As always, perform a quick function check to make sure that everything is installed correctly. If everything looks good, then we're already 1/3 of the way done. Now let's move on to the slide. Start by removing the recoil spring and the barrel assembly. We'll come back to them later. First, let's replace the nozzle. Start by removing the plastic plate at the rear of the slide. Use a screwdriver to force the plate downward. This reveals an E-clip and an O-ring which are attached to the nozzle return spring. Remove the O-ring first, then remove the E-clip with a small screwdriver. At this point, the nozzle return spring has been detached. However, we still can't remove the nozzle as we also need to remove the nozzle lock. Push down on this pin. This will allow you to remove the lock, which doubles as the mock extractor. I found that simply shaking the slide and bumping it against the table was surprisingly effective for removing the lock. On the right, we have the pin that we were just pushing down on. On the left, we have the mock extractor / nozzle lock. As you can see, the original and new nozzles are pretty much identical, the only difference being the material. Before we insert the new nozzle, apply a light amount of grease to the rails and O-rings. After inserting the new nozzle into the slide, it's time to reinstall the nozzle lock. Start by reinserting the pin notch side down. While pushing the pin down, press in the mock extractor. To reattach the nozzle return spring, start by pushing the E-clip on with a flathead screwdriver. Pull up on the E-clip to make room for the O-ring. And stretch the O-ring around and into the gap. Make sure that the nozzle return spring is working correctly. If it is, reinstall the back plate. This should be a tight fit. If it isn't, then you might be missing the O-ring on the back of the nozzle return spring. If you've made it this far, good job. All of the hard parts are done. We just need to install the new barrel assembly. This is a good time to apply a light amount of grease to everything. Remember to get the bottom of the hop-up unit and the slide's rails. These parts come bone dry, so it's important to lubricate them or they will experience more wear and tear. Removing the original inner barrel is very simple. Just pull off the buffer and washer and the barrel comes right out. Here are the two assemblies side by side. On the bottom we have the new assembly. While they do look very similar, the new steel one has a much flatter finish. After inserting the new inner barrel, do not reinstall the buffer and washer. If you remember from earlier, the enhanced recoil spring is actually longer than the original, so these parts are no longer needed. And we're finally done. I can't wait to get this out of the shop and start testing it. So let's move on to the review. And I've got to say, this is a lot of fun. The felt recoil with CO2 is absolutely amazing. It feels pretty similar to a .22 caliber pistol. With green gas, the recoil is fairly slow and sluggish, but with CO2, it's really snappy. The enhanced recoil spring really helps to close the slide much faster after each shot. The gas efficiency isn't too bad either. I found that I can get about 2.5 mags from each CO2 capsule. Specifically, I'm using Crossman cartridges, so your performance may vary depending on what brand of CO2 you use. And that's not all the good news. I'm also happy to report that the FPS does not skyrocket out of control. It comes in at a fairly consistent 300 FPS with 0.2 gram BBs. That is roughly 30 FPS above what green gas has given me. Nice. But due to the striker fire system in this replica, we also need to test the trigger pull. CO2 has a much higher gas pressure, which means that it should take more pressure to open the output valve. A while ago, I released a video about testing the trigger pull, and we got a reading of about 5 pounds and 2 ounces with green gas in the magazine. Originally, I placed the gun in a vise to prevent the recoil from having an effect on the reading. However, there are 3 reasons that I've changed how I'm doing the test for this video. Firstly, now that I'm a bit more familiar with the gauge, I have found that it's tuned to ignore sudden jerks. So, hopefully the recoil will have a minimal impact on the reading. 2, we are really only worried about the relative change here, so a precise reading shouldn't be necessary. Please refer to my previous video if you would like to see the better test. And finally, 3. Due to the recoil of this replica, I am concerned that locking it down could damage the polymer frame. So yeah, I would prefer not to risk that happening. In this new version of the test, I am simply pushing the replica against a table to prevent it from moving forward into the gauge. And we ended up with a reading of a little over 4 pounds and 9 ounces with green gas. Wait a minute. Why is the reading so much lower than in my last test video? Well, this is something that I've actually suspected for quite a while. The trigger pull is lessening over time. This is most likely just a part of the break-in process. The only question is, when will it stop decreasing? However, for the purposes of this test, this shouldn't really matter. We just need a relative starting point to compare against the CO2 version. Speaking of which, with CO2, the trigger pull didn't really change too much. We actually ended up being a little bit lower at 4 pounds, 8 ounces. Most likely, this slight deviation is simply due to the lax testing conditions. So overall, I'm pretty happy with this. We get way better recoil, better FPS, and pretty much the same trigger pull. Now, it's time to get serious. I do have a couple complaints about this conversion. Firstly, the magazine weight. These magazines are substantially heavier than the originals. The green gas magazines only weigh a little more than an empty real steel magazine at 4.9 ounces. That's really light and one of the features that made the GHK Glock so appealing to me. When using GBBRs, you're already carrying so much weight, and it's nice to reduce that somewhat. On the other hand, the CO2 magazines weigh 8.5 ounces. That is almost twice as much as the green gas version. Adding an empty CO2 capsule brings that number up to 9.5 ounces. However, that isn't necessarily a bad thing. I would guess that most people who buy this pistol are primarily interested in having the most realistic pistol possible for both collecting and training purposes. 9.5 ounces is very close to the weight of a fully loaded real steel Glock magazine. So maybe for some people, this is actually a positive feature. Okay, second issue. Unfortunately, this conversion is not official, at least as far as Elite Force is concerned. So no Glock trades on the back of the mag or on the base plate. So that's a thing if that matters to you. Overall, I quite like the CO2 conversion. If you have the steel slide version of the GHK Glock, I would highly recommend this. I really don't think that a pistol like this was intended to be powered by green gas. The slide is just too heavy for that. Alright, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you have any questions or other comparisons that you would like me to try, let me know down in the comments. If I do test anything else, I'll include that in the description and pinned comment. And until the next video, stay safe, guys.